From the Toronto Star, I'm Adrian Chung, and this matters. Pure chaos. A mob in London surrounds Justin Trudeau. Just seconds before he boards the campaign bus, rocks are thrown at his head. Politics in Canada is at a new low. The scenes on this campaign trail are not one-offs. Everywhere, protesters frothing with rage and hatred. Their demands a swirl of conspiracy theories, anti-vaccine misinformation, rampant racism, and death threats. Much of it is directed at Liberal leader Justin Trudeau, but he's not the only one. Candidates report swastikas sprayed on their lawn signs. Another protester yelled slurs at NDP leader Jagmeet Singh at a campaign stop in Windsor. How has Canadian politics become this toxic and dangerous? On This Matters, a two-part episode, my colleague Susan Delacourt, national political columnist, reports on what she's seen and heard from the campaign trail. Then, investigative reporter Grant LaFleche joins us to report from inside the social networks of protesters, threatening to tear this election apart. Susan, thanks for joining us. Hope you're keeping sane on the campaign trail.
As sane as one does keep on the campaign trail.
You were there at Justin Trudeau's campaign event in Cambridge, Ontario, one of many stops in the lead up to the election. You saw the crowds up close. Can you describe the scene for us? What did you hear? What did you see?
So first of all, I should say this is not my first rodeo. I've seen a lot of protests over the years. I have never seen anything like this. I have never, ever seen anything like it. And I know that neck of the woods too. I'm from there. My hometown of Milton, Ontario is just down the highway from Cambridge. So it was nice to see all this familiar territory. You arrive, and then first a little handful of people start showing up. And they kind of bracketed the bus. And then you saw a lot of cops because there had been the incident in Bolton on Friday night where Trudeau had to cancel an event because of security threats.
Deeply sorry, folks. Unfortunately, for safety reasons, this event will no longer be taking place here today.
So then they start coming in sort of waves. So clearly they've got an alert somewhere and they show up. And first I thought, oh, it's going to be about a dozen people, wingnuts. And then it got closer to about 100 of them. And that was kind of intimidating. And they hate Trudeau, but they also hate the media. So they're screaming at us. Some of them have handmade posters, but some of them have professionally done, flags and one scary, scary sign, a poster of Trudeau being led to be executed, to be hanged. And they're just screaming. And these people are just screaming anything and everything. They're against vaccinations. They're also of the belief that Trudeau is the son of Fidel Castro. They believe that a national daycare program is to indoctrinate children. They have little snippets of information that they've taken off the net, and they're just screaming and screaming and screaming it. And they do believe that the Prime Minister, the Liberal leader, is the head of a child trafficking ring. So, yeah, it would be ridiculous if it wasn't so threatening, too. I didn't get the sense they wanted to hurt us or the Liberal leader at that very moment, but they wished we would be hurt.
So clearly this group wasn't just, my politics disagrees with your politics.
Oh, no.
This is misinformation. This was racism. This was sexism. This was intense.
Yeah, the CBC reporter, Travis, captured it on film. There was one black officer there, and they were calling him, I'm not even going to say it, but imagine the racism hurled right at a dignified member of the police force, standing there with a gun, and these guys were screaming in his face. They showed no deference, not just to politicians, but to members of the police, which I found astounding. That they were just yelling and yelling, yelling. It was hard to tell whether they hated the police, the media, or the Liberals more.
Maybe all of it, yeah. We know that politics, especially at the federal level, this is a blood sport. And of course, there have been divisive elections in Canada's past before too, as you mentioned. But I mean, when you take a step back, have you as a political journalist. With all the experience that you have, what did it feel like to see that kind of anger on the campaign trail?
So it felt a little bit like what we've been watching with Trump in the United States. And I know some reporters who actually went to some of those rallies when Trump was president or running to be president, and the threat felt real. I'm not sure this was this intense. The media, they weren't going to try to hurt us. The reporters I talked to on Friday night, who were also veterans, they said they were afraid on the Friday night, that they got the sense that the crowd, if they could have got at them, would have hurt them.
And this was in Bolton.
That was in Bolton, yeah. I didn't fear for my safety, but I can tell you I have never seen anything like this. My very first assignment in Ottawa, out-of-town assignment, I believe it was in New Brunswick. I went to a rally with Brian Mulroney, and there were some angry protesters there. And Mila, his wife, got stuck in the ribs with a sign, and Brian Mulroney went crazy over that. But that felt more like an accident. And, we talked to the RCMP a lot in Mulroney's days. Mulroney was a polarizing figure as well. And the RCMP, there was a really good guy aboard Mulroney's plane, Bill, who told us that there were a lot of threatening people in Mulroney crowds too, but they weren't organized like this one. Like these would be random crazies at a Mulroney thing. And we've seen, somebody broke into Jean Chrétien's house. We saw this current prime minister. It wasn't that long. I live in this neighborhood where his house is. And it was July 2020. Corey Huron broke through the gates with a truck full of weapons. And my neighborhood was in lockdown for 2 hours. So it does seem that there's an escalation in this, or it feels so. It feels a bit scary. But when I got home, I was talking to my husband. He told me that over the days since Friday night, there was an evolving narrative in the pundit class, that every politician is subjected to this. And I think anybody who is saying that has got to go out there and look at this in the face. 32 years I've been doing this. I've never seen anything like it.
When you mention Trump crowds, it almost reminds me of the crowds that we saw that were involved in QAnon. Not to draw a direct parallel, but, we saw the images of the storming of the Capitol. This, of course, didn't become as violent, but clearly all of this political divisiveness, this anger, it doesn't exist in a vacuum. They remind and sort of play off one another.
Yeah, I believe they've been emboldened, and they were yelling things like Trump rallies too. They yelled, "Lock him up." In this country, we want to take this opportunity. Lock him up. They called themselves proudly, "We're the deplorables. We're the basket of deplorables." They enjoyed that as well. So they're borrowing things from the United States and taking it here too. I wrote in my piece, it's like somebody took Trudeau's two biggest nightmares of his mandates, Trump in the first mandate and the pandemic in the second one, threw them in a test tube and came up with this hybrid monster that is now dogging him on the election trail. It made me really worried, not about the election. It made me worry about the country being ungovernable. That I don't want to overstate or get melodramatic or anything like that, but I really worry that what does it mean that we have these people in this country for anybody who governs? I get the sense that if Erin O'Toole was prime minister, Jagmeet Singh was prime minister, they would turn on those people too. Their hatred knows no bounds.
Right. So it's not perhaps divided just within party lines. This is something that is growing and building in Canadian politics that we've never seen before. And, I don't mean to downplay the toxicity that we see on social media. Obviously, the things that are written and said online, whether it be Twitter or anywhere else, it's really destructive. But then to see that kind of anger in the flesh, it is a different thing that we're talking about.
For sure it is. And two of my clever colleagues, again, been around the block, said Sunday was like watching Twitter come to life. It was as though that horrible CDNPOLI hashtag and all the garbage that spews through that channel had somehow jumped off the screen and landed in Cambridge on a dusty road.
It's almost too easy to write off crowds or mobs as being part of the fringe. There were, like you said, more than 100 people there who believed in this misinformation. They acted out in this hatred. What do you think this moment says about where we are in Canadian politics in 2021?
I think we've got to find a way to figure out what is going on there and what feeds these people. Not an insignificant number had brought their children. Apparently on the Friday night, members of the Trudeau team told me that Trudeau and the people around him were most disturbed by the children in the crowd. The children were yelling, I guess you can swear on podcasts, right?
Yeah.
The children were yelling, "F you, Trudeau," chanting. And these are like toddlers and little tiny children. I saw several people carrying babies. And you think, what on earth are you exposing these children to? You know, that many of the reporters and the people aboard the plane are parents, and they were truly disturbed at the sight of the children out there as well. Again, I did grow up around there, and I kept wondering, are these people that I knew, you know, in some form or another? It's a very white crowd. By the way, there's not a whole lot of diversity in that crowd at all, understandably, maybe.
But to your point, though, do you know them? The thing is, somebody knows them. They're somebody's neighbor. They are among our society in Canada.
It's funny, I am tiresome on this subject, and I often remind Trudeau himself or his people about this. I really liked this speech that he gave at the 2014 convention, I believe it was in Montreal, where he told Liberals, conservatives aren't your enemies, they're your neighbors. And this, again, seemed to be a distortion of that whole thing. And several members of Trudeau's team kept talking about it. These people are neighbors. I kept wondering, do these people not have bosses? I believe that my boss would sit down with me if he saw me on the news screaming in a crowd and maybe send me for help. I wonder what the friends and family of these people are thinking. They're carrying phones and they're either filming you reacting to them. So it's like a filmed standoff, or they're filming themselves, like really enjoying the attention, and they're playing to the cameras. I had a long conversation with one guy who was explaining to me that he felt sorry for me, that I was a journalist because I didn't understand how many lies I'd been told and that the business I was in was corrupt, et cetera, et cetera. And he said, peace and love. And then 5 minutes later, he's screaming at the top of his lungs that Trudeau is a pedophile. Another guy, I said, do you want to give me your name? And he said, no. And he was being really aggressive with the police. And I said, why are you here today? And don't you have any place else you would rather be? It was hot too. Like it was a blisteringly hot day. And the guy said, I wish I could be with my kids, but I have to be here. I have to be here.
Yeah, this is something that I don't think will go away with one election cycle.
No. And I think it is very short-sighted of us to think of this as a political problem. This is a governance problem. Kim Campbell famously said some issues are too important to be discussed in election campaigns. It's a paraphrase. This one is, this isn't a strategic problem for the election. And I think we should resist being dragged down that road. This is a real problem for governance of the country.
Susan, thank you so much. And if you hit the trail again, hope you stay safe.
Thank you.
That is Susan Delacourt, national political columnist for the Toronto Star. Coming up, we talked to investigative reporter Grant LaFleche, who reported from inside the network of protesters at Trudeau rallies. What are they motivated by? How are they organizing? Grant explains next. We'll be right back. Grant, great to talk to you. Thanks for making the time.
Oh, my pleasure, Adrian. It's nice to finally make a connect.
You've been tracking a group online that has made it their mission to disrupt, to yell, maybe in their minds rebel against Justin Trudeau and other politicians. What have you learned about them? Who are they?
Well, myself and Alex Boudelaire, the reporter from the Ottawa Bureau, we were looking at who was behind these protests. And they really turn out to be a manifestation of a growing movement that had begun really when the pandemic started. They were opposed to lockdowns back in March 2020. They've been opposed to masks. They've been opposed to vaccines. And now kind of the moment for them is vaccine mandates. And they have long been organized. When you see this eruption at Trudeau's events, which is not just heckling and jeering, it's also, people yelling that they want to hang him. And there was a sign in Waterloo which showed him being led to the gallows. This is a moment that almost as if these folks have been building to this for, 18 months, nearly 2 years since the pandemic began. And they have been, for that entire time, they've been using social media as the way in which they organize. I think we're used to thinking of movements as having a singular leader, right? We always are looking, whether it's the civil rights movement in the United States, whether it's Indigenous issues in Canada, whether it's more violent groups like the Proud Boys in the United States. You're always looking to who is the figure or figures who lead it. And that's not this so much. There are prominent members, but it's very organic. And so they've been on Facebook, they've been on Twitter, Instagram, and they've been heavily using a channel called Telegram, which is a messaging and social media app you can get for your phone, your iPhone in particular, that allows you to invite only encrypted messages where you can meet with people in this virtual world and discuss whatever it is you want to discuss away from prying eyes. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, they're very public forums. Telegram's a little more private. And so since the beginning of the pandemic, they've been sharing these conspiracy theories and anti-vaccine and anti-mask notions, all of which are wildly untrue in most cases. But this is where this stuff has been fueling. And for some reason, for them, Trudeau has become the focus of it. He's the guy that they now heap all of their anger and frustration and rage on. They truly believe that vaccines and masks and lockdowns are part of some insidious international, almost like Spectre from the James Bond movies, global villainous plot to control us and take away our freedoms, et cetera, et cetera. And he's become the avatar for them. And so what we have found is that the same method that they've been using to organize anti-vaccine marches, that they've used to even target Premier Ford at his home a few times in the past.
We have, a bunch of yahoos out in the front of Queen's Park sitting there protesting that the place isn't open.
That they're now using the same method to organize these disruptive protests at Justin Trudeau's rallies.
So not only do they not have one singular leader, it's also a hodgepodge of beliefs. A lot of it, anti-government, anti-COVID. It's a mixture of people who essentially believe in conspiracy theories, if not strictly partisan ones.
Precisely. And what we just did in the STARS investigative team last month, published a project that took us months to finish. And it was specifically about, how these conspiracy theories spread, who's behind them. And you hit the nail on the head there. It's sort of a big tent where you have, anti-vaxxers from the Andrew Wakefield, the measles vaccine causes autism group. That's false. You get people, what's called the wellness community, people who think you just need vitamins and pine needles and such to stay healthy. You have white supremacists in some cases. You have folks who are anti-government, hardcore. They would probably call themselves libertarians. The religious right is extraordinarily active in this group in Canada. And it's become this big tent. QAnon as well is in there. And it's become this kind of omni conspiracy theory now where all these different elements. So you and I could, both be opposed to lockdowns for radically different reasons. But, I could be a white supremacist and you could be a wellness guy. But we'll find common ground in this opposition to pandemic restrictions and vaccines. And in some ways, you're seeing an ideology that's very similar, although I think it's important to caveat their actions aren't the same, at least at this point. But it's very similar to the kind of philosophical makeup that you see of the folks who were involved in the January 6th riot at the US Capitol. It's the same kind of ideas. It's the same kind of vitriol. And even though one of the sources we spoke to for that story said, that many of the anti-vaxxers and the people who think that there's a huge global conspiracy to take away their freedoms, even though they're finding common cause with the religious fundamentalists right now, they would not want to live in a world that was governed by the religious fundamentalists, the religious extremists, because that would be a bit like living under a Christian Ayatollah, which they wouldn't dig at all, right? Common ground here.
So sometimes their beliefs even clash with one another, but they do find enough similarities to be part of these channels to connect with other partially like-minded people. And they've used Trudeau as a figurehead for a lot of these so-called issues.
Yeah, precisely. One of the ways to think of it, look at something like QAnon. Now, QAnon started in America. It hinges deeply on Trump, but a big part of it is this idea that there's an international, global, satanic pedophile ring that's trying to take over the world. Now, many of the religious extremists who are in this movement will say, vaccines are a literal plot by the devil. Like they really think that the devil is manifesting itself or himself somehow in this. So when you go to some of these anti-vaxxer rallies, you will see people say, this is a satanic agenda. Well, that's actually speaking to different groups at the same time for different reasons, even without the speaker identifying, what precisely he or she means. And yet Trudeau has become, I think, because he is been the prime minister through the pandemic and he is a liberal and he generally, some of his foibles notwithstanding, is regarded as some kind of a progressive. He is seen as the flashpoint for them. He is the guy that they think if they can take him down, that they can somehow deal with the rest. And I imagine that is why they focused on him in particular. And just quickly, Adrian, to your other point about how these aren't necessarily partisan conspiracy theories. One of the things Alex and I found when we did this story the other day was that there's not a lot of overt party affiliations. There are some people, if you look at it, and some of the more prominent members, they lean and will support Maxime Bernier and the People's Party of Canada, who are just fairly fringe. But most of the time, they're not declaring a party allegiance, and they're not fans of the Conservatives and Erin O'Toole. So, I mean, it's not as if, these folks are attacking Trudeau but are voting for his chief rival. They're attacking him because they don't like him. And if you follow the message boards, as Alex and I have, they're just as unhappy with the sort of official Conservative establishment as well.
There are so many parallels. You mentioned QAnon, and while there is an element there, what I'm really thinking about too is the way that these conversations exist online, but that they've also translated to real people showing up. Because I think it's fair to say that the sheer size of that group, it caught journalists, it caught campaign managers out of step. They didn't realize who would actually show up. And what have you learned about how they coordinate these plans? Because again, this is a very disparate group of people, but they were able to get hundreds of people to show up in one place. That's not nothing.
So what we found when you're following these channels, it's really quite interesting. So there's a couple of levels to it. There are a handful of people, I wouldn't necessarily call them leaders. They're not directing people, but they have high profiles, right? They have somebody like Chris Guy, who's a very well-known anti-vaxxer COVID guy. One of the women we talked to for our story was a woman named Samantha Denunzo. She has, between her Instagram and Facebook pages, has something like 10,000 followers. And they issue these call to arms, right? They say all the emotionally jingoistic things that have been said in this community since the start of the pandemic, and that fires people up. And then somebody somewhere gets their hands on the Prime Minister's itinerary for the next day, and they post that in the Telegram channel. And then you just start to watch this very organic development where, if you and I are on that channel, you'll say, oh, I want to go, but it's in Cambridge today, but how do I get to Cambridge? And I will say, well, let's carpool. And they will start to organize themselves that way. And the other thing that they do, aside from organizing just the logistics of it, organizing carpools, telling people where to go, where to meet, reminding them to bring signs. They will discuss what kind of messaging they want to use at the event, which usually boils down to a lot of vulgar, threatening or quasi-threatening language. They are able, just by doing that, they're able to organize people to go. It's really kind of fascinating to watch because there's not a single person, there's not, you can see there's not a PR person involved. It sort of evolves extraordinarily organically.
It just sort of begins rolling through the channel and people communicate and say, oh, I can pick you up there, or let's carpool, or what have you.
You also see what I guess you could term scouting reports on locations. So Alex did a story as a follow-up to the one we had done the day before, because one of the things we found when we investigated this channel, which I should say has shut down since we published our first story, they shut it down. And I investigated a related channel where somebody said, we had to shut it down because it was infiltrated by a journalist from the Toronto Star. But they're also targeting Ontario Education Minister Stephen Lecce. A big theme of these groups from the beginning is they have to protect the children, which again appeals to people across the spectrum of this big tent for different reasons. And people were taking photos of his home and his backyards. People would know what it is or where it is. There were people reporting on who was coming and going from the minister's home or office. And then eventually there were people saying, hey, can we pool our money together to hire a private eye to dig up dirt on the minister? So it's not just showing up and saying, I want to protest this politician's policies or this government's policies. It's we're targeting this person. We're going to target him at his home. We're going to make sure that he cannot speak to people at events because we're going to threaten to kill him, et cetera, et cetera. It's just an extraordinary level of vitriol combined with this organic level of organization that historically is kind of unique to social media that didn't really exist before.
I think back to that Bolton event in Ontario, which of course was canceled because it was deemed by Liberal Party officials and security to be a threat because of the protesters. And I wonder, should this be a wake-up call to political leaders and to Canadians generally, that what we're seeing really isn't politics as usual, that there is something deeply toxic in our waters? What do you think?
I agree. I think on the one hand, it's understandable that the political parties, and for the context of this conversation, the Liberals in particular, did not foresee that this was going to happen. On the other hand, if you have been following the anti-vax, anti-lockdown conspiracy theory movements from the beginning of the pandemic, as I and a few other journalists have, this was almost entirely predictable, that they would find a target, much like Ahab in the white whale, where he heaps all of his rage and hate on this one animal. It's the same thing. They are Ahab, he's the whale. And I think that it was probably predictable that this was going to happen. But you're right, it's not politics as usual. I mean, I've been covering politics as a journalist for 23 years. I've lost track of how many elections at all 3 levels of government I've covered. Protests are not uncommon, particularly if you have a controversial leader or a politician who is a flashpoint for something. The difference here is I've never seen, with maybe the notable exception of some far left people who have targeted Doug Ford for different reasons. I think at one point, remember, they had a guillotine out at Queen's Park. That's pretty awful. But I've almost never seen people shout at the prime minister, "We're going to hang you, you effing this, you effing that," and having signs showing him being led to the gallows and etc. And I think it should be a wake-up call to all the major political parties. It should be a wake-up call to the press for people like you and me, because this is maybe a minority of people, but they're loud, they know how to organize, and they are willing to go quite far, clearly, in the way in which they're going to push their messaging.
Disturbing stuff there, Grant. Thank you for your reporting. Really appreciate your time.
My pleasure.
And that is Grant LaFleche, investigative reporter with the Star's investigative team and St. Catharines Standard. That's it for today. Thanks so much for listening. I'm your host, Adrian Chung. Our This Matters team is me, Adrian Chung, Brian Bradley, JP Fozo, Matt Pern, Morgan Bachnick, Raju Mudar, Saba Aitazaz, and Sean Patton. Our music is by So-Called, Mike DeAngelis, and Sean Patton. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us your comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com/subscribing matters. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.